All right, hola, my peeps. Finally gonna get down to the nuts and bolts here. Uh, we had a we had somebody. Before I start, this is intended to. This is going to be shattered visage. Shattered visage is going to be the title to this with a subtitle, and it's going to be a several part, beginning as a 3 part kind of little series, but it's going to cover. This is going to be a part of the kind of foundation for every course. Is going to be this Shattered Visage series. So, and this particular video is going to begin our new course on the anatomy of identity, which I'm gonna love. This is my favorite stuff to talk about here. So we had a friend, a very old friend, somebody who was actually one of the first members of the initiative ever when we built the group. Myself and a friend, Nilesh Seeker, built the group. Nilesh has since wandered off on his own pilgrimage and vanished altogether. Nobody knows where he is. So, Nilesh, if you're out there, we want you back. Everybody's looking for you. Anyways, Adela Tesla Trismegistus, I believe is how you pronounce it. He commented, he's a member of the Remnants program now, of course, and he posted a comment saying that identity is made up of subpersonalities, as he says, or subpersonality fragments that he refers to as being like ghosts. And of course, anybody who's been with us should know that that's been our stance. That's always been our stance. Adela, it turns out, was one of the very first members and happens to be one of the few people who are actually into what we're working with here and has a great mind for it and is very invested in this field. But for whatever reason, wandered away from the initiative until just recently and didn't even really know what we were doing until now. So he signed up with the Remnants as soon as we launched it, and he's one of the more vocal people on there as it stands. Of course, we just began, so we don't have a lot going on yet, but the investigation is there, and this is to explain some of the basic elements, I suppose you could say, the fundamental crux of our investigation and what the remnants are working with. This is, you could say, what's behind the science of time mechanics, as we used to call it, or what is now soul mechanics. So this is the base of soul mechanics, where Adela states that identity is made up of fragmented subpersonalities or ghosts that, as we've mentioned before, can create a phantom entity, which is what we're working with when we speak to the nature of the shine and the shade. That's what we're working with, and we'll get into that in another course under this Shattered Visage series or title. But for this one, to begin the anatomy of identity, I should like to speak to the nature of shards. Now, where we begin at the root of personality, at the root of identity, what we have is consciousness. Consciousness exists. We know that it exists, and because we are it, and so we're trying to work with it in a scientific by a scientific measure, and coming off of the initial fixed single consciousness that we would say is the one soul that we are all a part of, this soul shatters. Upon reflection of itself, it shatters. It picks itself apart to identify, to examine itself. We've discussed this in the one of the earlier introductory episodes for secular theology that was called Fundamentals from Scratch, that we discussed this and what a potential or a hypothetical process of it might be. Now, this is, of course, we're working with the logi still. This is a hypothetical standard, but this is the measure by which we've been working for a long time, and this is how we began to build time mechanics in the first place. What eventually becomes soul mechanics now, or principal dynamics is the course on engaging it, but it is still soul mechanics at its root, is this basic understanding, which the initial identity, a single identity that we're all a part of, upon inspection of itself, upon examining itself for the purpose of identifying itself, upon its own identification of self, it breaks itself into pieces that can be examined individually. You could say upon reflecting on your identity, and you can see this happen in yourself. So this is, again, it's of a cosmological nature. We can look at ourselves as a microcosm of this greater macrocosmic identity, and we can say that, well, if we operate this way, there's a good chance it operates this way as well. So that's how we identify it. That's how we launch the examination into looking at what's true about ourselves. And we can do this on an individual level. But principal dynamics essentially is teaching you how to do this and what you can do with it. But upon reflecting on your own identity, it causes shards of yourself to isolate or fracture. And when they do, what's essentially happening here, and this is what we posit happens with the initial first cause, is that upon reflection, the identity fractures into shards that isolate. And what's happening there is memory. The stuff of existence is memory. It's simply something that remembers what it is. An object remembers to be what it is, and gravity holds it together. So we have memory and gravity, the two basic fundamental elements of existence itself right there. We have something that remembers to be what it is, a form. It's information. It is information. That is just something in formation. And I guess we could refer to anything and everything as being matter. Thought forms can be material. So we have to use the word material essentially to make a distinction between that which is etheric and that which is what we call physical. But in reality, everything is physical. Nothing is outside of the realm of physics. We just don't understand. We do not yet have a basic understanding of how physics operates on an immaterial level, what we call an immaterial level. But we're stating here that thoughts in and of themselves, identity itself, is a sort of material. And it can be identified, it can be worked with, and it does have applicable laws of physical laws to it. So what shards are essentially these shards that break off of an initial identity, the initial identity, are clusters of values that create a kind of a personality trait or a characteristic, a general understanding, a basic comprehension of self, of who and what you are, what you do, that sort of thing. Just general collection of answers to questions makes up a personality trait or characteristic that it becomes a cluster of values that we'd call a shard. And a shard can, if you break a shard off of yourself, we learn this, the Monroe Institute covers this very firmly, and it can teach you all about how this works. The Astral Body is a book that can explain all about how this works, or what our hypothesis and our theoretical perspective of how it should work. We know that it does work. This is theorizing how it works, but it stated that not only can this happen by accident, but you can actually go ahead and make this happen, that a shard can be broken off of the self, isolated, and then it can go on to assimilate other stray shards that are loose from people or from identities, or shards that are loose in the value system of people. It can assimilate them, it can collect them, and become its own personality. And this is how we hypothesize an individual soul or mind is born. That pieces of a person can break off, collect other pieces, and become a new person. And that's how and this is not different from physical reality. We posit also that reincarnation, as it stands, is passing on your genetic structure. Having sex with somebody, a lady friend or what have you, depending on your sexuality, and reproducing sexually is passing on your information. It is reincarnation in and of itself, and thereby the identity that's created is made up of pieces and it assimilates other pieces as it moves along. A body assimilates other physiological features and traits. What we have in play there is what we call morphogenic fields or morphogenetic fields. That's something we'll have to look into later, but that is a facet of this. That's how the evolution of the mind happens, how the evolution of the personality transpires. Anyways, that's getting off track. Shards clump together to create personalities, and we can assimilate shards from other people through emulating other people. We can associate pieces of other people's personality to our own and develop further in our creating our own personality. And that's what these shards are. You can also break them off, and they can that you can through trauma and through the mind control, uh, or thought tech, through the thought techs we've been discussing, and the features especially of the monarch mind control programming and that sort of thing. It's essentially based on breaking people's identities into pieces, isolating shards, and causing for them to develop their own identity. So we know that this works, and we've seen it work. We've experimented with it ourselves. I personally have experimented with and experienced this. So we know that it works. We know that this is the way it works. We're just looking into figuring it out more precisely. But identity is a material. Reflecting on identity causes for that material to fracture into shards that can thereby assimilate other shards that are fractured, hanging loose. Free energies, as we've spoken to, free energies and ground energies. Ground energies, it's difficult to explain. Ground energies can be assimilated, but only by breaking off free parts of them. This is something we'll get into later. But in any case, we have memory and gravity essentially created right there. The fundamental elements of existence. Memory being material that remembers to be in formation, remembers to be a formation in formation, and gravity is basically just what holds it together. And the laws of gravity are gravity is applicable to physics, material is applicable to physics, physics governs all of this. What we have then, the third piece that is created when values or when shards recollect, when they reconcile, or basically when they relate to each other, when two or more shards reflect upon each other, they have considerations that develop aspects, and this is your perception. We would say that shards essentially are like the material of consciousness, and when you direct your consciousness, your attention at a shard, it's going to hit it and it's going to fracture into many different considerations that are the aspects attached to the values involved. So this is it's a little bit much, intellectually speaking. You guys can talk to me. I'll try to make it simpler, but this is as simple as we can get it. If anybody's having trouble, I'm sorry, but essentially breaking a shard down to scratch leaves you with values. Values are the essential fundamental components. Values are to identity as values are like to identity as particles are to matter. So when we speak of matter, material as being the physical aspect, so to speak, while thought forms can be as pseudo-immaterial, a kind of etheric, harkening back to what our scientists used to call the ether. This is what it is. They failed to identify it precisely, so they kind of canned the idea. They got rid of it, gave up on it, but that was a mistake. The ether is a substance that's in play, and it is still physical. But that's what we call, or at least that's the name we can give to this. When values essentially on their own, a value is ultimately meaningless. It just is what it is. It's when a value reflects upon another value that relativity comes into play and creates aspects. Relativity being the third fundamental element of existence. Memory, gravity, relativity, that's what makes life happen. That's what makes consciousness there. It's uncertain as to whether that's what makes consciousness happen or that's just how consciousness works. Either way, it doesn't really matter, because that right there, that's getting at the boundary and getting to a point where we can go no further. We are going to try and break that boundary and move further later on in the course, but as it stands, this is how we know it leading up to the boundary is memory, gravity, relativity is consciousness, essentially, is awareness. But values that reflect upon each other can harmonize or empathize, essentially, creating aspects that these aspects are like the glue of ourselves. Aspects are what hold values together, and they're the gravity of it that create shards, that create personalities, and then create persons and communities and societies, going all the way up the chain to the ultimate conglomerate all, which is again the alpha and the omega. We both begin and end with that all, one, CRE. So aspects are what are really relative to the values, that the relativity to a value, that aspects have their own magnetic frequencies. Like gravity, it's the same thing as gravity, only on a different, more subtler scale. It's subtler than matter, but it's still, there's still gravity in play. It's subtler to matter as we know it, but this is still matter. It's all matter. Everything's the same thing. There is no difference. There is no supernatural. There is no otherworldly, except in the sense that you can say it's something is different than we know it. There's normalization, I suppose you could say, but there is no supernatural. Everything is natural. All of this is nature in play. Now, these signatures, these frequencies create signatures. These aspect frequencies, they line up to create specific signatures of gravity or energy. Signature frequencies that draw at each other and connect with each other and draw at each other. Uh, i.e., a solution for a problem. The solution to a problem. A problem would create a certain frequency. The solution would create a certain frequency. And the brain knows how to calculate drawing that one frequency to the other. And that's what synchronicity is. Magnetic compatibility. It's subtle, very subtle gravity features in play that both interact in the brain via neurons and responses in the brain, chemical responses in the brain, neuropeptides and neuron activity, neurons firing two at a time, creating these signatures that happen in the brain, which can happen in as small a space as the brain. It can happen in such a way as for you to have a question and then create the answer comes to you in your brain. It can be that small. But for larger instances, like pulling a person to another person for a specific reason, it's going to be the reasons in play. The aspects essentially create reasons. Aspects attached to values in combination create a reason or a meaning. And essentially, it's the reason that creates the meaning. We'll get to that later. That's more philosophical look at things, but it's that's what's in play. And I posit personally that we know that we cannot isolate a value, a material value. We can't isolate it in time, space, and show it to you via some mechanical procedure yet. But we can identify the presence of values happening in the brain. We can see neurons firing, connecting to other neurons. We can see where certain words are locked up in combinations of neurons in the brain, where the brain stores certain types of information. So we can see values happening in the brain. And I personally posit that the brain itself is like a map of existence, that we experience we're only experiencing what's happening in the brain. We know that. That's a rock solid fact. That's the fact of matter, or the matter of fact. But I posit that the brain itself is like a switchboard of existence, that the brain is a map of everything that could happen in life. It's the brain maps out values, and the combinations of values create experiences. And so we can literally create. This is how dreams operate. My theory, this is how I'm saying dreams operate, is that we have a map of all potentialities already existent in the brain. Everybody shares the same map, but it can be altered depending on their experiences and how they decide to assimilate certain shards of values. It's basically the map, or the brain is like the matrix, and we're living in the matrix. And everything that's happening outside of it that we think is happening outside, out here in the brain, there is no out there, really. It's just we are experiencing it in the brain, and that's how synchronicity happens, is signatures firing in the brain. That's my and we get from that we experience feedback. We experience feedback from the presence of other personalities and the presence of the ultimate overall personality, basically like a baseline something, the boundary itself. We bounce our signatures off of it in combination with other signatures, creating synchronicities. We bounce that radiation, I suppose you could say, off of it, and we get feedback in the form of experience via experiential data like thought, matter, emotion, or thought, action, emotion, which we're going to speak to the three pieces, but ultimately there are three pieces: mind, body, spirit, essentially, that are feedback. That's experiential feedback coming off of gravity, memory, and relativity as the essential fundamental elements. So that's it. That's basically that's our explanation with what is now soul mechanics. That's the soul mechanics explanation of the basic structure of existence itself. So I to balance all out, or to make it all make sense, is that the general idea here is obviously it's coming from my perspective because I started it. If anybody can change my mind on it, they will, but my perspective is coming from the mind. I'm a blue. So I posit that everything is identity, that the basic bottom line substance of existence is based in identity, personality, awareness. And we know this is the case. I mean, we see this in any science that we utilize. So we understand that at the very least, awareness and consciousness is one of the primary directive factors in the creation of reality. But I posit that identity itself is the structure of reality, and that this is how it's made. So there you go. I'll make a commentary on this to try and make it smaller. I'm going to start making commentaries on a lot of my videos, and those commentaries are going to be hidden. They're only going to be available to anyone who joins the Remnants program, the Remnants of Tomorrow, on Facebook, and actually gets involved with our exploration here. So get involved, become a member of Remnants, and you'll get a lot of extra cool shit that I'm going to try and do the best I can to provide stuff that's cool, especially regarding interviews and such. I'll do interviews with people that might not be available via my channel, that you'll have to get it from my channel through the Remnants program page. So sign up, jump aboard, let's kick some ass here. If you have anything to share or say about this, any questions, any comments, anything to add or exchange, that your opportunity is presented. Thank you so much for your time, all of your time, literally. Kila Salai, Terve Uni Siari. Namaste.